right. Is everyone looking at the PowerPoint or my email?
We're looking at the PowerPoint.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay. All right. So we will be presenting today briefly on how we can use technology specifically relating to XR in what was the word of the year last year, the Metaverse. The year of this year, of course, is AI, in order to help mitigate, not treat, very importantly, for the approach that we're taking here, some of the symptoms related to, and again, I submitted this last year, submitted to ASC. There's a debate now happening in the community relating to autism spectrum and whether or not it should be classified a disorder or a condition. And so we'll discuss, roughly how we can treat that discussion at the end as far as the classification and diagnoses. But I'm Dr. James Hutson from Lindenwood University. I'm the lead XR disruptor here, as well as doing research on neurodiversity and emerging technologies. I'm joined by Caitlyn Mcginley from the Center for Developing Minds. She's, of course, in developmental and behavioral pediatrics. So she's a specialist in working with children with these diagnoses, and I'm on the tech side. So I will bookend the presentation, and she will talk about the specifics related to her field in the middle. So I think, are we seeing the slides advance? Are we doing
Yes.
good? Okay. All right. So I've been conducting research in this particular topic for about a year now. And what we discovered as part of the pandemic, as everyone had, is that we moved online, we adopted new technologies, we saw billions invested into XR technologies such as Meta, more or less successfully, but we're going to have different types of abilities to join and talk to one another and socialize via VR and other avenues here soon, as that becomes more widely available. So what we found in our research was that inadvertently, we saw that students that were presenting with ASD or ASE symptoms in online classes and even face-to-face performed much better when given the opportunity to do so in a VR environment, an immersive learning environment. So we found that if they were allowed to use an avatar, if they were allowed not to, even as we're doing here, I can see myself, and everyone can see themselves if your camera is on. And so you're very aware of your expressions, your tendency to mask, your need to control certain tics and or certain behaviors. And so that's taken away, we found, in once again, a kind of metaverse space, which now allows us to more adequately address a lot of the inequalities in society, especially the expectations around extroversion, because of course society is designed for extroverts, not introverts, which is rather ironic because the individuals usually in charge of teaching them have introverted qualities themselves, even though they're rewarding extroverted qualities. So, but we're in a new world now. Notice that we're all not together in Colorado, even though Cheryl is there in Colorado, but we're all over the place. And so, but we're still, able to come together and share these ideas remotely. And that's going to be how it is largely moving forward, because it affords the sharing of information. Once again, it's more cost effective. We can move research forward much more quickly with scholarship as well. And once again, business can be conducted much quicker and more effectively this way. So the reason why the research we've been conducting, we believe is significant, is that we are still treating technology and those with ASD or ASC, we can discuss that, as though it's pre-pandemic period, right? Before we had these technologies, before the new normal of having every meeting, even if I'm right across the hall from someone else, we're still gonna meet via Teams or Zoom, right? I'm not even gonna walk across the hall anymore. It's more convenient for me to be working on my computer. And so because individuals that are either having introverted qualities or ASC prefer these types of minimally stimulating environments, they prefer to be, by themselves, having, as far as a working condition, a separate, closed and quiet working space, etc. And they need more time to regulate. We need to start thinking about the benefits of social virtual reality and XR. Obviously, mixed reality and AR are going to be seeing most of the research and the funding over the next 6 months, especially as Google gets ready to launch theirs. But we already know that coming out of the pandemic, we had a lot of individuals that were experiencing isolation, depression, anxiety disorders because of the formative years of their life. They were separated socially from their peers. And so studies have shown that with a feeling of presence that's made possible through these scenarios, we were also able to increase the sense of enjoyment, of relatedness, of, once again, these social activities, which once again for neurotypicals is leads to greater senses of well-being, but opens up a whole other world of possibility for those that are neurodiverse. So now I'm going to turn it over for the statistics to Caitlyn Mcginley, and then you just tell me when to move to the next slide.
Fabulous. So as a clinician in this field at one of the leading centers in the country, working with kids, we've seen a huge growth in the population post-COVID. And this is really attributed to access to knowledge on the internet and also medical professional recognition as the spectrum continues to kind of get a wider and wider definition. We've also seen this with other neurodivergencies such as ADHD, hence the Adderall shortage, and the government saying it is a prescribing problem, which we can get into that later. But basically the diagnostic statistical manual, which is what a physician would use to assess someone and whether or not they have autism, will basically be looking for differences in social approach, conversation skills, interpretation of behavior and facial expressions. And again, this is a wide spectrum. So some people might be quote unquote more impaired in terms of verbal output than other people. It is really not a one size fits all thing. And at this time, interestingly, a lot of the data is showing that males are 4 times more likely to get a diagnosis. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are 4 times more likely to be on the spectrum. It is a data capture problem. So we have not found a biological mechanism for this. And so that leaves the room for sociological arguments, of course. So are girls being socialized in a different way to mask? And mask means to, prevent yourself from, having differences in social approach or doing some of the more stimming behaviors that you might be familiar with in terms of autism. And so are girls socialized to not necessarily embrace their identity in the same way that boys are? It's kind of like the squeaky wheel gets the grease argument. And there's an ongoing debate as more adults become of age who have been, diagnosed with being on the spectrum. That's part of their identity. They get a voice in the community and say, ABA therapy, which is a common therapy used, is actually abusive, and teaching people to tame themselves and fit into society. We can move on to the next slide. So in the sense of autism, there's many. Autism is a spectrum disorder, like I've said, or a spectrum condition. And so, again, it's not a one size fits all thing. So a lot of people who are on the spectrum experience something called sensory processing disorder, but you also don't need to be on the spectrum to experience sensory processing disorder. Many individuals with ADHD also have it. Many neurotypicals also have it, but it is basically your wiring is different and very sensitive to changes in light, sound, smell, taste, touch, movement, internal sensations. And so therefore you can become overstimulated, and your approach to integrating into social functions can be different. And we can move on to the next slide. So if you're not familiar with autism, autism clusters with many other attributes and recognized disorders / conditions. It's comorbid with ADHD. It's typically found when people have, language impairments, social deficits, and some of these repetitive behaviors that are often linked to OCD or other stimming behaviors. Sleep deficits and mood and anxiety as well is common, but again, it exists on a spectrum. And so some people who are nonverbal, they can still have a very high IQ. Some people are hyperlexic, meaning that they can read at a much earlier age than normal, at a much faster pace and the higher than average intellect. And then some people have cognitive impairment. It is actually very reflective of society at large. And some of the things that James has been talking about why XR can help is that some of the symptoms associated with autism are poor eye contact, repetitive actions or words, or sensitivities to the stimuli. And so, of course, people are more comfortable engaging indirectly in social situations because of that, and prefer digital communications. And so, when you're thinking about autism and how it presents, there's, as people get older, digital communications are preferred, and as XR, VR has been implemented, and you can even see this also in other sectors of the internet, especially video games, people can prefer communicating via avatars, which reduce the requirements to mask. And so how this translates to the XR space is virtual meetings can remove some of that social anxiety. It allows for indirect communication. You can control, the sound input on your computer, the light input on your computer, your background, how you're presenting. And so when you allow customizability to how you are perceived socially, you actually find people engaging at much higher rates. And I'll toss it to James.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Caitlyn. And she pretty much wrapped everything up, and we are at the 12-minute mark. So I'll just do a quick summary here. Here's the main kind of takeaway that we're trying to get across, and that is reframing the conversation surrounding autism spectrum disorder condition now. And the main argument there is that we're starting to know and understand more and more about this particular set in ways in which the mind is going to be processing external stimuli in the population. And we just sent out another article yesterday to get published on underdiagnoses of females with autism. My wife, of course, self-identifies, as do I, and we have a child as well that was diagnosed. So it's really, of course, close to the research that we're doing in trying to understand how to support people better. And as Caitlyn was mentioning, understanding the underlying symptoms as being different from person to person. That being, we need to be able to modulate and change and make people comfortable so they can perform. And we have a crisis in a labor shortage right now as well. And we have many autistic adults that are unemployed and want to work, but we're going to need to think about accommodations. Those that went undiagnosed and need help later on. But then, of course, we need to start supporting especially the female population with diagnoses earlier on and getting them support, because they are taught to look people in the eye, to mask, to have these other social behaviors that make it difficult to diagnose if you're only looking for the traits that are more associated with males. But most important thing we have here is we do not need to treat individuals with these symptoms and fix them in the same way that we were trying to use Florio and other types of VR to help them behave as we would understand in social situations, such as having eye contact, such as keeping a conversation going with peers, such as engaging with people and acknowledging their presence, for instance, or they need more time alone. So instead of trying to make them adjust to a world that no longer exists, we need to use the technology to adjust the world to them so they can actually achieve the best results and the greatest well-being possible. All right, well, thank you all so much. If we have any questions, I think we have nope, we are out of time, so I apologize. I'm not going to be eating into other people's time, so we can save hopefully some questions for the end. And now,